Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Heisenbottom,
And I'm Mike Carlson.
and welcome to the View from the U.
Okay, Brian, we're going to go right into Heisman chatter. Huge weekend in the Heisman. Huge week, actually, if you count Thursday's matchup of Oregon and Stanford and Baylor and Oklahoma. We're going to touch on Baylor and Oklahoma a little bit later, but right now let's focus on Oregon and Stanford. Stanford, yet again, best Oregon. And Brian, Stanford has Oregon's number clearly. Has beat this offense that puts up 77, 80 points per game these last 2 years, and they've beat them in a dominating fashion. I mean, you look at the score of 26-20, and you think that, well, it came down to a final drive, and you know what, maybe Oregon slipped up at the end, or maybe a call didn't go their way, but that's not the case. I mean, Stanford was up 26-0 on them at one point in the game, and it was just kind of some of that like garbage time where Oregon got some of those extra points. And I think this boots Marcus Mariota without a doubt out of the Heisman candidacy, just because he doesn't have that signature win under his belt. He has an amazing stat line, Brian. I mean, this guy, you would think that he plays touch football on the weekends. He has such a great stat line, but he doesn't have that intent. He doesn't have that signature win. When you, I guess I'm saying that every person in the every person in the Heisman race has an amazing stat line like that, and you know that's a qualifier. That's how you get into that Heisman race. But he doesn't have that win that puts him over. He doesn't have that winner, that thing that puts him over the edge. He doesn't have that intangible, that extra, that plus one that you need to win the Heisman. And I think that by default, I mean, Jameis Winston had a great weekend. Let's not fault him at all. He had a great weekend. I think he is right now effectively my number one, followed by Johnny Manziel, who, like a phoenix from the ashes, Brian, has played exceptionally well these last couple weeks and is right back in the Heisman race. And then finally, it's rounded out by Bryce Petty at Baylor. Petty has played amazing, Brian. I mean, touching on that Oklahoma-Baylor game, he made Oklahoma look terrible. I mean, he really made that what a good Oklahoma team look really, really bad, and was able to lead his team to victory, while his contemporary Mariota was not. So I think that he right now is my number three. Winston's my number one, just because he's been there all year, and I think that he deserves that spot. And then right now, Johnny Manziel sitting at number two. Brian, he has played amazing these last couple weeks, to say the least, and I'm really happy to see that. A lot of people are probably asking why does this guy deserve to be in the number two spot? I mean, you look at his record: 3 losses. That's not exactly something to hold a candle. That's not exactly, I mean, something to take pride in, especially in college football. So, but I think that just the fact that his intangible is not that signature win, it's the fact that he won the Heisman last year. I mean, this guy deserves to be in the conversation, Brian. As a former Heisman winner, he's almost entitled to that. He kind of gets grandfathered in to this Heisman race, I think. So, going down the stretch, I think it's going to be a battle between Winston, Manziel, and Bryce Petty down there at Baylor.
Yeah, and if you look at, I mean, Johnny Manziel, he's sort of like a safety pick. That's really what I'd say. It's like picking Bama to win the SEC. It's like they're probably gonna do it, so it's safe to put your money on him. But yeah, I mean Johnny Manziel, he doesn't have that signature win, but he comes through in the clutch. The only reason I think he didn't win against Auburn is because they hurt his shoulder. So if you break a machine, the machine will not work. But I mean, yeah, if you're thinking about the Heisman and the if you think about the Heisman, while it may not necessarily be Johnny Manziel's year, he is definitely a Heisman-worthy quarterback. And I was listening to a talk show earlier this week, and they said there are 3 things you need to do to upset Alabama. You need to stop A.J. McCarron, you need to beat their defense, and you need to have Johnny Manziel as your quarterback. So not necessarily good news for my Auburn Tigers, but that is definitely that is definitely a factor in the Heisman, the fact that he is Johnny Football and he does have this reputation.
Exactly, and I mean, a lot of people point to the fact that he couldn't beat Alabama in the clutch, and and that's 100% not right. That's 100% an unfair judgment to make. He played amazing against Alabama. He threw for 5 touchdowns, had 2 interceptions, but his defense, I guess, couldn't stop the Alabama attack. And you don't want to point fingers, offense or defense, but I think if Manziel's defense plays a little bit better and gives him more opportunities, I think they come away with a victory against Bama. It's just that I mean, it's tough to stop Nick Saban's offensive attack. I mean, you got A.J. McCarron, T.J. Yeldon, a plethora of amazing wide receivers. I mean, you have the Cadillac of wide receivers out there for McCarron to throw to, and I think as any defense, that's kind of a tough thing to deal with. I mean, when I talk about LSU and Alabama, I'm going to touch on that a little bit. So I think that Manziel, he's right in there just because he's Johnny Manziel. He has that name, he has the moniker, he is the brand Johnny Football. So
Yeah, and I don't think the Yeah, and I don't think the LSU Bama game should really be a factor in there because Bama wonks, they're a more well-rounded team. I mean, Johnny Manziel is a much better quarterback than A.J. McCarron, but the Alabama defense can beat the A&M defense any day of the week. The A&M defense has really been struggling. They allowed so many points against Mississippi State and an Auburn team that was just gaining their steam at the time that they won. Um, but, I mean, yeah, Johnny Manziel could have won that game if he had a Bama defense behind him.
exactly, and I mean that's the difference. I mean, you hate to point it out, and you would have much rather seen Johnny Football and his, I guess, ragtag kind of defense come through against Alabama's offense, but that just isn't the case. So I think if you look at the stats and the fact that Manziel is the Heisman winner from last year, I think he's right there behind Jameis Winston.
So switching gears now to the top 25. The first pair of teams I want to talk about is 3 and 4, Ohio State and Stanford. I was really bummed because I was loving this little streak that the BCS had of where teams lost, and instead of Ohio State moving up, they got bumped right back. And now I guess the streak ends because of the one loss because Utah beat Stanford. And the problem with that is that Utah is not a respected team anymore. If you look at Utah's season, it is pretty much take USC season and mirror it. This team started the season on fire. Their only loss was to Oregon State, which was an absolute shootout. But they're really not respected now. They're 1-5 in the Pac-12, with that one win being against Stanford, and it really does sort of tone down their reputation and really makes them very very susceptible to being overtaken by Baylor if they have a shaky game, which is really going to dictate the rest of their season. Because I'm pretty sure they should have a resounding win against Cal, but closing their season against Notre Dame, that's going to be very, very tough because Notre Dame's a very high quality opponent, even if they did get upset. So moving on now, the 24 and 25 spots, Texas and Georgia. Now I requested Texas last week, and I have no idea why they got in this week. Because if you look at their game, they went to overtime against a West Virginia team that's sort of been not what you'd expect from the West Virginia program. I mean, granted, they don't have that big quarterback anymore in Geno Smith, but I mean, they're just not performing to the standard West Virginia level that you'd think. And doing so well against a team like Texas, it really begs the question, are they getting in because they have a good record and they're the University of Texas? So moving on to a sort of a different situation is the University of Georgia. Now, I mean, Aaron Murray, great quarterback. I have the utmost respect for him, but they lost to Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's doing better in the SEC than they've done in previous years, but that was still a key loss that does need to play in. And though they're coming back, and we'll definitely see that when they play Auburn this upcoming week, there are just those things that you have to take into account. I mean, if those things were always disregarded, then I have no doubt USC would be in the top 25. But they do have those losses that really do sort of lower the level of the team. And University of Georgia is just not. You just can't think of them up there in the SEC. You can't think of them giving Alabama the same run for their money in the SEC championship that they did last year because of some of the losses that they've had. And finally, I always end the show with a request because the BCS tends to appease me whenever I make these requests. Mike, I'm gonna have you guess. It's a team from the ACC, huge surprise team. I'm a huge fan of. Would you like to have a guess?
I don't know, Brian. I think I kind of know, but I don't want to ruin my image on a YouTube right now with a bad guess. So I'm gonna turn it over to you. What is it, Brian?
All right, it is Duke University. This is a team that they have been doing so well in the previous years because Duke is one of those teams that I think, like Kentucky, it's like, all right, we have football season, but if we can just endure, we'll make it to basketball season and be okay. Now is not the case. I mean, they do tend to get played down because their quarterback, Anthony Boone, he's sort of the guy you go right to when you think of a program that's doing well. And Duke is a lot like an Auburn. Their quarterback isn't the best throwing quarterback, but I mean, they have a great defense. They have a very athletic offense, a very strong run game, and I mean if they win this week, they can win out and make it to the ACC championship, which is just absolutely astounding, and I'd love to see happen. And they really do deserve a spot because the ACC is really sort of making a surge with Florida State especially, and they just deserve a spot in there. So, with that being said, Mike, I'm going to hand it over to you for your call on LSU and Bama.
Okay, Brian, this was a great game to watch for the first three quarters. You're talking smash mouth, SEC football, back and forth. And then in the end, that Alabama defense just wore out Zach Mettenberger. But Brian, because I love quarterbacks so much, I myself cannot be a quarterback because I am 5'5" and am undersized by NFL standards as a quarterback. I'd like to focus on the two quarterbacks in this game, Zach Mettenberger and A.J. McCarron, two guys who I guarantee will be playing on Sunday for many Sundays to come, as both these guys are great quarterbacks. But I want to point out the fact that, in my opinion, I think Mettenberger outplayed McCarron in this game despite getting the loss. You look at McCarron's stat line, 14 for 20, 3 touchdowns, very ho-hum Alabama, type of attack. But you would think that he threw the ball like a lot. He threw for a ton of yards. That's not the case, Brian. Just 180 yards of passing yards. And for a guy who's going to play on Sunday, who's projected to play on Sunday, you expect 3 touchdowns and 300 yards. You expect him to be, in and every play, passing on every play, getting the ball to his wide receivers on every play. But that wasn't the case. Mettenberger had 241 yards and only 1 touchdown and didn't have as great of a completion percentage, but I think he definitely outplayed McCarron in that Mettenberger. I think he played in that Mettenberger with what he was given around him, played a lot better than McCarron, because with McCarron, you got so many options. It's like having a tool belt around you. You got T.J. Yeldon, you have many good wide receivers, you have the coaching of Nick Saban, the offensive coaching, a stellar offensive line that would rival some NFL teams' offensive lines, and then you have the fact that you're Alabama. That's so many tools in your Alabama utility belt that it's pretty hard not to win games like that. I don't want to say anything, but I think it'd be pretty easy for me, I think, to step in there and go win a couple games at Alabama if I had all those things at my disposal. And I think Mettenberger on an LSU team that has been very, underwhelming this year. They haven't performed to those great standards that was set to them, and those great standards that are usually associated with the Les Miles program. But I think that Mettenberger, he played a better game than McCarron, and that with what he had, he did a lot more, despite the stat line maybe not showing it in the total touchdowns he scored, or stuff like that. But I also want to spotlight, Brian, T.J. Yeldon. In case you didn't know about this guy, he's an exquisite athlete. This guy will be a great running back for many, many years. I've seen him. I watched him play, and he looks like a football player when he's out there. He takes the ball. He makes great cuts. He has great speed, can evade tackles. He has great downfield ball carrier vision. And he had 2 touchdowns and was the player of the game, in my opinion, for an Alabama team that just totally destroyed LSU with a 38-17 score. And I think that Nick Saban, he's happy for 2 reasons this week. The first reason being that he beat LSU, and the second reason being that he can now burn that Oregon game plan that he had been working on for so many weeks now, as Oregon is not going to play Alabama. And I think that if you're an odds maker in Vegas, or if you're just someone betting with one of your friends, that Alabama's in chances, they increase that much, Brian, because you would expect against an Oregon offense that kind of mirrors, I don't want to say is exactly similar, but kind of mirrors what Texas A&M kind of has going on. Mobile quarterback, spread out the defense, and just kind of see where it goes from there. Very chaotic, a lot of different reads. And in the past, it's been shown that, offenses like that tend to give Alabama trouble. And I think that if you're Saban, you're the enemy that you don't want to face is that Oregon offense, where there's so many variables and it's tough to game plan around. So I think Alabama's chances, they go up a lot, Brian. I really do think that, because Oregon they're a chaotic team, and they could have been that Alabama kryptonite, but I think that there's a relief off of Saban's chest, and that he doesn't have to face Mariota and company. So this is going to be a great race. Coming down to the SEC championship game, Bama hasn't shown so far that they're a beatable team. Mettenberger, I mean, had played a great game at quarterback, and he kind of showed that, you know what, if you have a great quarterback, you have a shot. You're at least in the ballpark of beating Alabama, but you're not completely out of the woods. So I think that, I mean, maybe that kind of foreshadows a little Jameis Winston giving Alabama troubles. But, Brian, this is an Alabama team that is just so good year after year. And, I mean, how can you not be when you recruit the number one players, you have A.J. McCarron at the helm, T.J. Yeldon in your backfield, and just a defense, I mean, that is so good and so smash mouth that, I mean, it's ridiculous. Alabama right now, Brian, I mean, they are the clear-cut favorite to win the BCS national title this year.
And with that Oregon loss, the tables completely turned because you think of Alabama versus Oregon. This is just going to be a super high-powered Oregon offense, seeing how much Bama can resist them. But now you're looking at Florida State and a defense, which I believe is one of the best in Division One, just with how they performed against Clemson. I think it's going to test A.J. McCarron a lot more because, if you look at some of the defenses, he's put up big points against defenses like Texas A&M and Colorado State, teams that really aren't known for their defensive strength. And Florida State is just ripping through these offenses. And Jameis Winston's asking for a break. They're doing so well, but yeah, it's really shaping up. The BCS national championship is really shaping up around Alabama, and that's really the hype. It's who's Bama going to play.
Exactly, and I think that there's a Florida State. This is a Florida State team, Brian. You bring it up. They have a good defense, but they have a very underrated defensive backfield, and that they are very strong at the safety and cornerback positions. And I think that's where McCarron might stumble a little bit. I mean, LSU has a great tradition of having great defensive backs and great guys who cover wide receivers well. But I don't think McCarron has faced the kind of caliber defensive backs that are at Florida State. I really don't think that. And I think that could definitely throw a wrench into Nick Saban's plans in that A.J. McCarron, he's going to face a tough defensive backfield. And I feel like if you can't utilize A.J. McCarron to his full stability, if you don't get him involved in the game, then whatever happens with T.J. Yeldon, that can't happen either, because you've cut off that one line of offense for the Crimson Tide. So, I mean, Brian, we're shaping up. Last year, Notre Dame, Alabama was kind of pegged as a huge game. Battle of the superpowers didn't really shape up to be that. But this year, Jameis Winston in Florida State versus Alabama, Brian, that is looking like some mighty fine TV to be watching come BCS time.
And especially since the ACC has really risen up to parallel of the SEC, starting really with Clemson defeating Georgia.
Exactly, and I think that, I mean, if it was from any other conference, if it was from the Pac-12, Big 12, Big East, Big Sky, whatever conference you're from, discount double check conference, I don't care. I think that if it was any team from one of those conferences, they would not hold a candle to Alabama. But I think because it's the ACC, and the ACC is kind of going through those changes that the SEC underwent a couple years ago when they became that mega powerhouse, where they become that conference that wins every BCS national championship game, I mean, for the last 7 years. So I think that the ACC is becoming that, and I think we're going to have a clash of two superpowers, maybe with the winner of that one being the superpower for the next couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, the ACC was always the SEC's little brother, but now the little brother's growing up, and he's getting as tall as the older brother. So we're going to have some real conflict there with those big, like Florida State, Clemson, all those big names.
Okay, Brian, now let's switch it over to your game. Your game was also a great game to watch. So why don't you fill us in?
All right, yeah, this game, Stanford, Oregon, I could not be happier. Go Cardinal. Yeah, I mean, the Stanford defense, what I've always known them, what I've always known they were capable of doing is destroying the reputations of quarterbacks. I mean, like you and I are talking, but the week I covered Stanford, UCLA, we were worried that Brett Hundley would just light up the Stanford defense, and they exposed in Hundley that inexperience, that characteristic that made him, not good enough to overcome the Stanford defense. And the same happened with Mariota. It's happened earlier in the season with Keith Price of Washington and Sean Mannion of Oregon State. These guys just came in, they played Stanford, and they really sort of lost their reputations. And Mariota is no different. I mean, if you look at the stats, his yardage may still be up there, but his completion percentage was way down. I mean, they were losing downs. They couldn't finish drives. Mariota's passer rating went from 88.1 as like in the game against UCLA, which in UCLA was they had a very good defense for most of the time, but it dropped to 76.7 in this game. And that's because mostly of two guys who I'm a huge fan of, Trent Murphy and Shane Scove, the two Stanford linebackers. These guys are a team. If you want to think of them in chemistry, watch Remember the Titans, look at Gary Bertier and Julius Campbell. These guys are just always on the same page, and in that game you did hear Scove's name called a lot more than Murphy's, and that's because Murphy was pushing him this way, right into Scove's arena, where he could just make the tackle for a loss. I mean, these guys are just the heart and soul of this Stanford defense. And a couple of weeks ago, Mike, you and I were talking. We were saying that Stanford has their position because they are Stanford. But this week, they threw that superstition out the window and then burned it in the yard. Kevin Hogan may not be known for his arm, but he showed his legs in this game, and they were fantastic. Probably sounded a bit weird, but he rushed so well, got so many yards and a touchdown, and that's something you wouldn't really expect out of a big Stanford quarterback, because Andrew Luck had the big arm, and that's not really the Stanford program you see very often. But Tyler Gaffney is, also one of my new best friends. He is the heart and soul of the Stanford offense. They're a very run-based offense, and what they did, and they did with great success, anytime there was short yardage, just run a little draw play off the left tackle, and 9 times out of 10 you will get a first down. That is how Stanford kept their drives going. They got to 3rd and short and then just plowed through his Oregon defensive line. That's really the name of the game, because Stanford really was unstoppable until they got to the red zone. Then they kicked so many field goals. But when in the open field, when they're not necessarily in field goal range, they just kept driving and keeping the Oregon defense on the field. So, I mean, huge BCS implications. If you haven't seen them yet, they're little modified shirts. They're Oregon shirts that say "We want Bama" crossed out, and underneath it says "We forgot about Stanford." That definitely describes what happened. I mean, Oregon was so high flying, and they forgot that their Achilles heel is the Cardinal, and they really paid the price again this year. And that's really all there is to say. So, Mike, come back on and talk about it next week.
Okay, hold on. But first, Brian, you're bringing a tear to my eye, my man. You're talking about Shane Scove. I love that guy. I read the Sports Illustrated article on him in the college football preview, and I think this guy's awesome. You want to talk about a guy who's a total nerd, but loves to play football and kind of reps that football nerd mentality. I mean, you're looking at a guy like Shane Scove. I love this guy so much. He's a great linebacker, and he's a great presence at Stanford. Actually, he coined his own term for his defense, and he calls it the party in the backfield. And not only did Stanford have a party in Oregon's backfield, they had a full-on rager in Oregon's backfield, so that was really cool to watch. I love the fact that you brought up Shane Scove. I was waiting for that moment when you would bring up Shane Scove as this guy's awesome. He's a great linebacker. You wouldn't, by meeting him, know that he goes to Stanford unless you saw that he wore the Cardinal. But he's a very smart guy, very intelligent linebacker. So he's one of my favorite players to watch, and I follow him on Twitter. This guy's great. So he's a cool guy to follow, very smart guy. So I'm so glad you brought that up, just because of his implications, and just because he's kind of underrated, I think, at Stanford. You think of Tyler Gaffney, and you think of Andrew Luck still, despite the fact that he's been in the NFL the last 2 years with Stanford. But I think this guy, he's one of the guys who can plateau to that area that Andrew Luck was at, that national kind of stardom. He can become that new face of Stanford. So, God, I'm so happy you brought him up, because he's such an underrated guy in college football right now. Points to you, my friend. Points to you.
Yeah, if only they didn't lose to Utah, you'd be looking at the sky and he's like, hey, look at this guy. He is the next Manti Te'o. And he really does. He does have that. What?
Continue. Continue. Go ahead. Continue.
Have that same sort of air around him, but it's just a shame that Stanford, just with that one tough loss, isn't going to be in national championship contention. Definitely they can go to the Rose Bowl or any other BCS bowl, which they should go to, but he's just not going to get that press, which is just unfortunate.
Yeah, and the Rose Bowl, that's been Stanford's bowl the last couple years. You look at, I mean, the Pac-12 has just dominated this bowl the last couple of years, the Rose Bowl. So I mean, Stanford well on their way to another Rose Bowl, but it doesn't taste as sweet as heading to a BCS championship game. But I'm definitely smelling roses down at Stanford, and hopefully we'll touch on them later in the season when we do a little look at the bowls.
And Oregon will probably again be in the Fiesta Bowl, tasting the chips. Chips.
Exactly. So fast forwarding, Brian, a week ahead, I'm going to be covering Auburn and Georgia. Brian, more SEC football. I cannot get enough. I spent a little time on the West Coast, spent a little time down south with my Baylor Bears. Now I'm going to be in the Southeast with Georgia and Auburn. It's going to be a great game, Brian. But I think this is an Auburn team that is just going to dominate Georgia. I mean, you're looking at Aaron Murray. He's kind of in a Tom Brady type of situation. He's a great quarterback, an elite quarterback. He just doesn't have all the weapons. They're all either injured or they've all moved on to the NFL or to wherever else they had to go. So I think that because he's lost all those weapons, he's lost his running backs, his wide receivers. I'm surprised he hasn't lost his left arm yet, Brian. I mean, this guy has just been he's been the victim of a lot of bad luck this year. And I mean, you look at the stat line, he clearly has a better passing repertoire than Oregon's quarterback, or than Auburn's quarterback, excuse me. But I don't think that he's going to be able to pull it off, and I think that your boy Trey Mason's going to come through huge. And plus, let's face it, you're playing in Auburn. It's a tough place to play in general, but I guarantee you that stadium is going to be packed for a top 25 matchup. So, I mean, Auburn has the clear advantage in this game, and they have a clear route to the SEC championship game, which is going to be really cool, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if you've been to Auburn. I have. And one of the coolest things about it is that when you walk in, the stadium is already like flat above you like this. So Georgia's going to be walking in. It's going to be exactly what the game is set up for. They get off the bus and immediately, Auburn is towering over them, and they're really going against the world because, I mean, Auburn, Gus Malzahn is my new favorite coach ever, and I really see Auburn as sort of like the new Oregon. They may not have the passing ability, but make no mistake, these guys are quick. I mean, in Tennessee last week, I'm pretty sure on the special teams plays, the punter had more tackles than anyone else. But I mean, these guys can just run all over defenses because they have such a wide array of option and screens and straight up runs, and this Auburn offense is deadly.
Exactly, and I mean, you look at it and you point. It's not the Auburn offense with Cam Newton where you look at Cam Newton, you're like, that is the guy. The offense runs through this guy. He is the quarterback. He is the only offensive threat on this team. Don't bother covering anyone else. You have to focus on Cam Newton. This is an Auburn team that's surprisingly well-rounded. You look at Nick Marshall, their quarterback. He's good, but he's nowhere near Cam Newton good. But then you look at Trey Mason. He's kind of carried most of the load this year for this Auburn attack. But you cannot win football games by just running the ball with Trey Mason every single play. So you have to pass it. Marshall's been a great complement to that offense, a great player. And I think this is an Auburn team that could give Alabama a run for their money in the Iron Bowl. But we'll leave that up to a later episode, Brian.
So we'll keep an open mind. So now I'll be in the ACC this week with a game that has very heavy ACC championship implications, Duke and Miami. Now you heard me talk about Duke earlier in the show, and these are the implications of the game. Because if Duke wins this game and then wins out the rest of the season, and Georgia Tech loses to Clemson, which I mean, I'd like my Yellow Jackets to win, but that's kind of a far cry. But if Duke wins and Georgia Tech loses and they win out, then they will be going up against Florida State in the ACC championship. This is a team. I mean, I said it earlier. When you think about Duke, you don't think football, but their football program has just been built up very nicely. They're so well rounded, and they may not have the huge passing attack that you may expect in most schools, but they are sort of like a Auburn that's a little toned down a bit. They're a very good rushing team. Their defense is astounding, and I'm actually picking them to upset Miami because everyone had such a high opinion of them after they beat Florida, but going against Florida State and again against Virginia Tech, it's sort of like a call to reality that Florida isn't having their best season ever, and that win is just meaning less and less.
Exactly, and I mean, you would think Duke and Miami, this has got to be a Final Four matchup from last year in a March Madness type of pool. This has got to be someone's final that they picked. But these two football teams very underrated, I think, and I'm right there with you. I'm hopping on the Duke bandwagon. Colorado native Max McCaffrey, he's on that Blue Devil attack, so I'll be rooting for him Saturday. And I think it's great to see that Duke football is it's becoming relevant again. Because I think for a little while they were the laughing stock of college football. It was like you said, let's just make it through football season, and then we can watch basketball. Like when does basketball start? And it was never a very football centric type of school. But I'm glad to see that Duke is kind of becoming a little bit more of a football school, still firmly a basketball school. That is Mike Krzyzewski University down there in North Carolina. But I think it's a great story to follow. And I'm right there with you. Duke will definitely be upsetting Miami this weekend.
Yeah, so thank you all for watching. We'll see you next week. I'm Brian Heisenbuttle.
And I'm Mike Carlson.
And this has been The View from the U. Thank you for watching.
See you later, everybody.